How do you implement ketones into your training?
Yeah. So what I'll do is if I'm doing like a key session specific to the race I'm going to do, then I'll use it. So like when I get into the phase of my training where I'm doing like my long runs is what's specific to what I'm usually training for. I'll do exogenous ketones like before and during that session. And that's low intensity because my key sessions are like at 100-mile intensity versus like if I were doing like say a 5K, then my key sessions would probably be like short intervals.
Right.
So I'm doing it like I'll do usually if it's just like a long run, I'll have like a bottle before. I'm going to play around with this a little bit in terms of just when I introduce this because there's no evidence that actually supports this, but there are some like speculations that by doing an exogenous ketone like before a session, before everything is kind of like humming along, that you could suppress your natural lipolysis a little bit and that could actively work against you. But it's just speculation and the research doesn't support that that's going to occur yet. So
have they tested that?
I don't think they've directly tested it, but what they have tested didn't show a detriment, even though like it's plausible that could happen. So I guess the best way to think is that we just don't know for sure. So if someone's skeptical, if they're like really nervous about that, I would say like chances are like you probably aren't going to, if you're doing something like an ultramarathon, like let's say you're running 100 miles, if you're skeptical about starting out with an exogenous ketone, just don't. And then introduce it like a couple hours in. At that point, then you could be like, the race is so long that like that first 2 hours isn't going to be the spot that like,
right.
That really kind of makes or breaks the benefits of it. So, I'm doing like basically a serving, and the servings I'm taking are going to be like 27 grams of the ester.
This is is it Delta G? Is that what you take?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Delta G ones, I use Delta G Performance. It's like this little blue bottle. They've got other ones like Tactical, which is like, even more. I think it's 32 grams. I like the blue ones because I mean, you've tried these before. They don't taste great. Like you're not like, oh, I'm ready for this treat. Like you might with like another sports product.
I've only tried the Ketone IQ.
Okay.
So they all kind of have that similar alcohol-y medicine kind of taste.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've come a long ways. Like I remember like I actually had I can't remember what company it was actually that sent this to me. It was back in like 2015 when this stuff was first kind of starting to kind of like surface a little bit more. I got sent some of the early stuff and it tasted like straight engine fuel. Like it was pretty hard to get down. And I started thinking, now I understand why people are getting digestive issues with this. It's like imagine having an upset stomach and then like layering that on top of it. But yeah, so the reason I use the Performance versus the Tactical is the Performance has a lot. They cut that kind of that taste down over a lot. It's kind of got like this like more like a blueberry-ish type kind of flavor to it. So I don't have a huge issue like just shotgunning one of those real quick and then chasing it with some water. And I'll do one of those like before a long run. And then if that long run is going to go longer than 3 hours, I'll likely like start dosing in maybe like half a serving for every like hour and a half or so from there. And that's just what I've gotten to land in that kind of 2 to 3 millimole range with. Whereas like we were talking about before, someone who's on like a high carbohydrate diet or even a moderate carbohydrate diet might want to dose more frequently to stay in that range if that's what they're targeting. So yeah, that's just kind of the protocol that I came up with, which is individual to me.
Yeah, it sounds very subjective based on your diet, your training routine, and then obviously which type of ketone you're actually using. Have you experimented at all with the Ketone IQ or the dials at all?
I have, but I haven't done a ton of like, I haven't looked at them as closely in like an actual training setting. I've done some tests where I just say like, all right, I'm going to take a serving of this type and a serving of this type, a serving of this type on subsequent days and just see where it moves the needle for me. Because I do expect it extrapolates in where like if I get a 2x response from one versus the other, I'm probably going to get an increased response when I'm exercising. So like, the esters are the ones that shoot it up the highest, the fastest. There's actually Delta G actually did I guess it would be an N of 2 like thing on their Instagram page, like I think it was maybe last week, where they did just that. They took and they actually matched for totals. So like one serving of ketone IQ is 10 grams, whereas the tactical, I think they use tactical and ketone IQ. So it was like 10 grams is one serving of ketone IQ. I think it's 32 is tactical. So they took like 3 servings of the ketone IQ, and then they took just shy of 1 serving of the tactical, and they looked at where that moved them. So they tested prior. They were like 0.2, 0.3 millimoles, something like that. They took the shots. They just kind of like goofed around for 30 minutes, and then they tested, and they would see where they landed. So I think they landed in the cognitive side with ketone IQ. I think it was like they were both between 1 and 2 millimoles for that. But they didn't get into that 2 to 3 side, and they did get into the 2 to 3 side with the tactical or the esters. I should just say esters because there's other esters out there too.
Right.
And that's really what's going to be the more important piece to that puzzle there. So even with matched serving size, they were getting essentially an extra, or like what would be like almost 100% increase, maybe a little less, 75% increase with the esters versus the dial.
Do you know, we're getting real in the weeds on this. I love it. But do you know the difference, like why the ester seems to be better than the dial? Like, is it just a different synthesis to create it, or like, do you know why that is?
Yeah, I can probably explain this simply as best as possible, without totally butchering it. But really the way to think about it is the ester is just pure. So like it's going to be like direct, whereas the diol is just a precursor. So it's just going to require more, or maybe the way to say it is more steps in order for it to actually like get to where you need, where like the ester essentially has the diol plus the actual ketone in it. So it has kind of like a double whammy effect, I guess is what you'd say, whereas the diol by itself is lacking that other part. So it just takes more of it to kind of drive that up there.
So how do you go about, like you personally, how do you go about testing this? Obviously you have like the finger prick, the blood, or the blood ketone monitor. Have you done it during training or only at home? Like, what does that process look like?
So this is the way I think people should do it, or how I did it anyway, is first just test to see what you get at baseline. So like wake up in the morning, test the blood ketones, see where you're at, and then do like a serving of whatever product you're trying to use, and see where that lands you. So like, let's say you do a serving and you're like way up into like the 2.9 millimoles, let's say. Then like, at that point at baseline, one serving is going to push you up into that point. So at that point, you're probably at a spot where if you started exercising, you'd stay in that range for, I think the research would suggest close to 90 minutes is when you would likely be starting to kind of like dip down underneath that range. Now, what I don't recall is whether you're dipping down underneath the 1 or the 2. I think it might be the 1 millimole spot. And then at that point, if you're looking to stay in that range, you're just going to dose to stay in there from there. And whether you do that as like a whole nother shot versus like a fraction of a shot is going to probably be like an individual question. So what I did is I did that first one and I was shot up into the high 2s. So I went out and started my run. And then when I would just test every once in a while to see when I would start dipping down.
While you were out running?
Yeah, I actually did this one on a track. I would test it. I tested it at hour 1, hour 2, and hour 3. And it was when I was getting close to 3 hours is where I was starting to dip underneath 2. So that's when I was like, okay, now it's time to like, if I wanted to maintain this, I need to start resupplementing it.
Would the intensity speed that process up? Like if you started doing intervals and like...
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm guessing that's like a 3-hour easy run?
Yeah, just like basically kind of like below my aerobic threshold, zone 2, 100-mile intensity more or less was what I was doing on that day. So I was basically trying to decide whether it was something I was going to try for a 100-mile race. And then if it was something that I thought like, okay, I can, it's not going to be like too tedious to land in that zone, then I try it at like kind of a B race and just confirm if it, because the next question is like, okay, cool, it worked for 3 hours, but does it continue to work? Like in terms of how, because with ultra running, it's always like you're eating stuff, you want that intended purpose of it, but you could also get a digestive issue. So I wanted to make sure like that it wasn't like, oh, I feel fine when I do this for 3 hours, but then at hour 10 I do it and all of a sudden it just wrecks me digestively and then I lose lose out on massive performance relative to what I could potentially get. So I ended up taking that training run data and extrapolating it forward into a race. I didn't test during a race. I probably, in hindsight, I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have tested blood ketones every like lap. I was a Rocky Raccoon 100 last year. So like really the only reason I shouldn't say the only reason, but the main reason I did that race last year was to test exogenous ketones to see if it was something that it would like create a problem for me. Because I was at that point I was thinking, okay, it's not giving me any negative things, and like I'm not seeing anything negative from this. It's potentially a positive. So like if I'm trying to like run my best race of the year, like maybe 1 or 2 times, or take a couple big swings per year, it's like, well, I'm probably going to try using it if it's not going to have a negative, it has no negative thing to it, and just hope for the best from the positives. But I wanted to eliminate the potential for a negative before I did it at like a race where I was really going to try to like push myself to the limit and get everything out of what I prepared for. So for that race, I was doing basically what came out to is a full serving every 3 hours.
And that was the ester from Delta G?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Every 3 hours. When go back to that track day where we're testing that during training, were you fasted? So I'm curious because obviously ketosis is associated with fasting, or like high fat diet, low carb. So could you be in ketosis, taking ketones, you get up to between like 2 to 3, could you start taking a bunch of gels, like high carb gels? Would that push you lower because you're then introducing more carbs? Like that dynamic seems so interesting.
Yeah. So if you introduce carbohydrate, you're going to drive down the ketone bodies. But in that context, you probably would want to, because if you're already in 2 to 3 millimoles from like your ketogenic diet, then it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. If you took a ketone shot on top of that, maybe they just don't know, but I'm pretty certain there's no reason to drive above 3. So other than potentially causing problems.
Right.
So for that person, like I think if they were to take in an exogenous ketone source, they probably want carbohydrate longer, so they actually like stay in that 2 to 3 versus go above it.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot to where you're getting in carbs still. Like, 'cause I'm assuming you still take gels and fuel during. So how many carbs can you take without going below 2 essentially, and then how many ketones do you have to take to stay above 2?
Yeah,
that's kind of the balance.
Yeah, and I was kind of running like pretty close to race day simulation when I did the exogenous ketones with the carbohydrate side of things too. So for me, I'm usually like, I was actually a little bit lower. I think I was closer to like 30 grams per hour of carbohydrate during that session, whereas on a race of 100 miles, I might push up to 50 grams. I'm usually like, based on my fat oxidation rates across the intensity spectrum that I've had tested in the past, like for me at 100-mile intensity, like 40 grams is a pretty good spot. It's like, it's enough to like make up for the ratio of carbohydrates I'm going to metabolize every hour at that intensity. And it's not so much where I'm really worried about a digestive issue at 40 grams. Now, if I'm pushing up to like beyond 60 grams, that's where I start worrying like, okay, I might end up just kind of flooding the system, so to speak. Or the way I should say it, if I wanted to do more than 60 grams, I'd probably have to really make that part of my training protocol of trying to train my gut to be able to tolerate more than that. So,
and then you'd have to take more ketones, you think, right?
Yeah. Well, if you're somebody who's even in that context, I would imagine so. I would think like if I went from like, say 30 grams to 60 grams, it would probably require more exogenous ketones in order to stay in that same zone that I did when I was at 30 grams.
Interesting.